The Center for Audit Quality presents Profession in Focus.
Hello, and welcome to this edition of Profession in Focus. I'm Cindy Fernelli, and I'm very pleased to have as our guest today Anne Sheehan. Anne is the Director of Corporate Governance for CalSTRS, the California State Teachers Retirement System. And she's here from California visiting us in Washington, D.C., so we're particularly glad to have you here. So welcome.
Nice to be here. Thanks for having me.
So let's jump right in. I want to talk to you about a recent GAO study that came out that talked about representation of women or lack of representation of women on corporate boards. And I think that one of the findings was that even though their numbers are increasing, it would take 4 decades at the current rate to reach parity of women and men on boards. And I think we all think that's not fast enough or quick enough. So tell me why investors care about this issue and what your expectations are.
Okay. Well, thanks for having me, and it's great to be here. Investors indeed do care about diversity on corporate boards, not just gender diversity, but all kinds of diversity. But we have focused on gender diversity over the past few years because obviously it's kind of the easiest to measure in terms of gender diversity on boards. And the reason we care about it is because it's a shareholder value issue. There have been a number of studies that demonstrated that more diverse boards and boards with women, at least 30% women, perform better. Both McKinsey and Credit Suisse have verified this through studies, return on invested capital, return on all the various different metrics that are used. So we do see it as a shareholder value issue, but also as a teachers fund, 879,000 teachers whose retirement we have to provide, 75% of them are women. It also, with the number of women who are beneficiaries of ours, it resonates with them that this really is an important issue in the year 2016 to get to, if not parity, at least 30% on the road to parity at some point. So it's an important shareholder value issue. So many shareholders care about it, and there are a variety of ways that we have pushed this issue in terms of filing shareholder proposals, engaging with companies, petitioning the SEC to provide greater disclosure in the proxy about the diversity and the skill sets of the board members currently. So there's a large group of investors and other groups that are really pushing this issue and trying to get more because the rate that, as you say, the GAO verified this, it's very slow. We've got to do something faster.
So you mentioned disclosure as a first step. And as you know, over the summer, the SEC looked at audit committee disclosure more broadly, and in fact set out that concept release asking people's views on the current requirements, which some would say are a little lacking with respect to audit committee disclosure. Tell me what your thoughts on that are. I don't know if you read some of the comments. I know that CalSTRS commented, but what are your thoughts on the broader issue of audit committee disclosure?
Well, we did file comments on the disclosure, and we were happy that the SEC sent out the concept release because it's been a while since the current disclosure requirements were put into effect in SK. So I think 1999, so 17 years, so it's probably time for a relook to see what more could be done. For us as investors, we look to the board to be our representatives, so it's very important for us to have a glimpse into the activities of the committee, and in this regard, specifically the audit committee. What's their role in overseeing the auditor? What's the role in assessing how well the auditor is doing? What's the selection process? Do they get involved in choosing the engagement partner? Do they talk to the company, the management about rotation when it's appropriate? What are the conflicts of interest? How are those covered? So I think from our perspective, a little more could be done in the disclosure of the audit committee report. I recognize a lot of folks, including yourself, would like to move to voluntary reporting and not require the SEC. I think if we see progress on that, that would be fine. But the concern that some of the investors have, including CalSTRS, is we really haven't seen much movement on that.
It's not quick enough.
It is not quick enough, and the language is still very sort of plain vanilla that they take from year to year and put in.
Boilerplate, as we like to say.
It is boilerplate.
In the
And
legal
so
community.
I think while we're happy to give them a year, but people need to step up and do this. We would prefer that the companies do it themselves, but at times they need a little prodding, and I think the SEC, by putting this out and investors responding, have thrown down the gauntlet and said, okay, show us that you're willing to do it. We've done a lot of engagement with companies on the audit committee and the engagement of the auditor, the length of time, the tenure of the auditor. We engaged with a number of companies who have had the same audit firm for over 100 years and have talked to them about how they assure independence of that auditor and no conflicts, those types of issues that investors care about.
So the types of process they go through.
And that's what we want to know, a little insight into the process that the audit committee uses to make sure they're overseeing the hiring, assessment, retaining of that auditor.
Well, and as you said, they do sit there in your shoes to represent your interests. So.
Yes, I depend on them to make sure they are asking robust questions about and really probing the audit firm about how things are being run at the company and not just letting management answer those questions on their behalf.
Good. Well, hopefully, as we look again at the CAQ in our barometer, we'll see even more increases in those
and I would
disclosures.
encourage you all to work with your members to say we need more disclosure voluntarily. This is what investors want, because it would be much better if they stepped up themselves and not have to go to the regulators for some sort of mandatory requirement.
Well, speaking of the regulators, I know you're the vice chairman of the SEC's Investor Advisory Committee. So tell me a little bit about that and how the SEC engages with investors and ways that you'd like to maybe see more engagement between the regulators, whether it's the SEC or the PCAOB or others, with investors.
Well, the Investor Advisory Committee was statutorily created under Dodd-Frank. Mary Shapiro, the previous chair of the SEC, actually created an Investor Advisory Committee when she came in and was named chair by President Obama in 2009. And Dodd-Frank put it into statute. So I was named as one of the original members of the Investor Advisory Committee way back when, in 2011. And it really was created to provide input to the Commission about the issues that are of concern to investors. What should they focus on? Since the goal of the SEC really is investor protection, and it's really to remind them these are investor issues. So over the past 3 or 4 years, we have spent time, made a variety of recommendations to the Commission on some issues that investors care very much about: target date retirement funds, some disclosure issues, the use of the universal proxy, a number of recommendations that have come out, and it's really been a helpful discussion with the SEC. The disclosure issue is one that the Division of Corporation Finance has a project underway, and so having that discussion with investors about how much more disclosure do you want, quality versus quantity, and getting the right disclosure, the really important disclosures. Obviously, from a legal perspective, materiality is important in the disclosure, and that sort of sets the base. But we would like to see a little bit more flavor and a little more information from the companies that go beyond just the minimum level. I recognize that the lawyers are concerned about the proxy and the liability, but it is both a compliance document and a communications document. And so it's a way for them to communicate some of the things that they're doing on our behalf to the investors through that. So I think the SEC is looking for input from investors on how they could tailor disclosure so it's really meaningful to investors and get rid of some of maybe the not necessary. I don't think it should be an exercise in just reduction in volume. I think it should be an exercise in quality and not focus on just reducing the quantity.
Yeah, you said effectiveness and quality. I think effectiveness sometimes is shorthand for cutting, and that's not necessarily
And that's the concern I think
thing.
some investors have, is this just, let's just slash and burn, or can we keep the really important information that we need to make decisions? Because we depend on that information that's disclosed in the 10K or the Qs or the proxy or whatever the document coming out of the SEC. So many investors are closely following what they're doing at the Commission.
Well, right. It's meant, as you said, a communication document for you to make investment and voting decisions upon.
That's exactly right. So we depend on that information, and we don't want to have to call through hundreds of pages to sort of get that nugget that really is important to our decision making.
Well, and you would think in this day and age, and I know that Keith and his colleagues are looking at this, how we can use technology to help that. It's so much different than it was when these rules went into place, when it was all paper-based.
And one of the recommendations from the Investor Advisory Committee was greater use of data tagging so that we could go through and look in a searchable format for some of this information. They've used XBRL more, and so could they put more of this in a format that could be tagged and we could make it more searchable because of the use of technology? And you're exactly right. And so I think they're getting there, but as with many agencies, they're sort of coming up to what really is the market best practice.
So.
But we're pushing them, the investors are pushing them on this.
Well, I know it's a huge priority for Chair White and for
Right.
Keith Higgins, so
Yeah, and
hopefully
I think
we'll see
Keith is
more.
very attuned to this.
Yeah.
So we're very hopeful in terms of the disclosure project over there and trying to get much more information. We're looking forward to the proxy disclosure part of that. They're focusing on SK and some other things now,
Right.
but we're looking forward to the proxy. And that's where on the diversity issue, a little more disclosure in there
Would be
about.
good.
Yeah. So
Well, the SEC and investors are lucky to have you,
Thank you.
on the advisory committee, and we're lucky to have
Thank
you
you.
today for this edition
Thank
of
you for
Profession in
inviting me.
Focus.
thanks.
So with that, I am going to end this version of Profession in Focus, and thanks for joining us.